Check with the people at the back that you can hear me. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction and the kind words. When you mentioned that I'm here 22 years, last year one of my staff, who will remain anonymous, got a letter from HR that he will now qualify for a 25-year long service award. And I said, you must be getting a huge prize. He says he doesn't even expect a watch, never mind, a huge reward. So I thought it was useful for me to stick around another 3 years, Magda, but I'm now reconsidering because, at some point you start to live for smaller goals in your life just to stick around. Thank you for everyone who's here. I hope that we have enough time for conversation and discussion. I will try and limit my talk to about half an hour, 35 minutes. And I'll also be available afterwards if people want to ask specific questions. I suspect that most people may have other commitments at around 2 o'clock. This presentation I've sent to Marlene for share, and I'm very happy for her to distribute it widely. She can put it where everyone can access it, so if you're interested. The talk today about predatory journals forms part of a bigger study that CREST has just completed for the Academy of Science. We were commissioned about 2 years ago to look at the state of journal and book publishing in South Africa. And as many of you know, the DET funding system for scholarly publishing for academics was revised in 2003 with effect from 2005, and a number of major changes happened, and one of the biggest changes is that the monetary value that are paid to universities for what you produce suddenly increased hugely. So at this point in time, universities get approximately 100 to 5,000 rand for every single authored paper that you produce. They also added masters and doctoral graduates. So the total amount of money that the Department of Higher Education and Training pays out every year to universities for scholarly output last year was nearly 3 billion rand. And I mentioned this because if someone asks me who's the biggest funder of research in the country, it's not the NRF or the MRC, it's the Department of Higher Education and Training. And when the moment that you start to introduce funding and monetary incentives and rewards into any knowledge production system, you have to be cautious about some unintended consequences. And so our brief was to look also at issues about quality and ethics in publication behavior among South African scholars. And in the course of our investigation last year, of course, at some point we became aware that predatory publishing has come to South Africa. And so this paper has a very specific, or this presentation has a very specific focus, and that is to see, could we estimate the extent, how prevalent is predatory publishing in South Africa at the moment among South African academics? Predatory publishing, I'll come to the word and its meaning, and I suspect that many of you already know that. But just a step backwards, there is now a huge body of scholarship developing about what some people call the perverse consequences of academics working in environments where there are so much demand for accountability, there's so much competition for funding, there's such an emphasis on research performance metrics that pervades our whole system, including performance appraisal, and the perverse consequences of that in terms of academic behavior. Now, some of these consequences we were aware of a long time ago. Salami publishing, which is where people cut up their papers into smaller and smaller parts to get more money. You had 20-page paper, you cut it up in 2 or 3 pieces, because the DET funding gives you exactly the same amount for a paper, whether it's 1 page or 20 pages, whether it's in a South African local journal or in a Web of Science journal. So that has encouraged this kind of salami publishing behavior. We know that there's a worldwide increase in plagiarism and self-plagiarism. You just have to look at the number of retractions of papers that is listed on the blog on Retraction Watch. And there are other forms of unethical authorship. But some of us believe that one of the more recent threats to the integrity of the scientific communication system, and specifically scholarly publishing, is the advent of predatory journals and predatory publishers. So very briefly, something about the term and its origins and who coined the phrase. The person who coined the phrase predatory journals is a guy called Jeffrey Beall, who's a librarian at the University of Colorado in Denver. And the heading there is very deliberate. He was called the watchdog, and I had to, for this presentation, put in brackets, now put to rest. He hasn't been killed, but pretty much silenced, because in the middle of January, suddenly, without any announcement, his website closed down, and it caused a huge flurry. So if you now look for Jeffrey Beall, because he had a website where he listed predatory journals, listed predatory publishers, that doesn't exist anymore. There's a huge discussion on the web, what happened there. Most people concur that he has basically decided to close his website under threats from both lawyers, other universities, and predatory publishers, because he has not been without controversy, and we can come back to why that is the case. Now, predatory publishers, predatory journals, first of all, are journals that, first of all, sits on the back of open access, the open access movement. Essentially, with the advent of open access journals, the possibility emerged that you can use the same system for other purposes and other non-scholarly interest. It's very important that one distinguishes between legitimate open access journals, of which there are many and which are listed on various websites. But what has happened is that the moment that we have moved to open access publishing, it allowed other people who do not have scholarly interest at heart to misuse open access publishing. And these publishers and predatory journals have been called predatory because they basically prey on the academic and publishing system, essentially for profit, for money making. That's the first thing to say, is that predatory publishers and predatory journals are in the business not of legitimate scholarly dissemination of knowledge. They are in the business of making money out of academics and students and whoever wants to publish. That is their sole purpose. And it then it goes through a whole range of other consequences. I have, in a paper that has been submitted recently for publication, I've put together this table, so I'll just take you through this. What I've done in this table is to compare what I would call standard publishing practice with predatory publishing practice according to certain categories. So some of these might be slightly contested, but I'm happy to discuss this. So the business model and the use of and the practice of author processing charges, in standard publishing practice, you would say that legitimate scholarly journals do not exist solely for profit. Of course, a large number of journals do make profit, and the publishers of some of the biggest publishers like the Elsevier's and these people do make profits out of their journals. That's another debate. Some people say that Elsevier is making way too much profit out of its journals. And many journals now charge author processing charges because the cost of publishing, even online publishing, is still very excessive. So the difference between predatory publishing and standard publishing is not that predatory publishing charges author processing charges and standard publishers not. But in many cases, the predatory publishing houses and journals charge excessive rates, and they really do exist solely for profit. On the origin of papers, I think, and maybe it's because I come from a little bit of an old school, I've always worked on the assumption that scholars submit their manuscript to journals when they feel ready to publish. We choose the best journals to publish. The publishing process is initiated by the scholar. Well, that's why I put there a standard publishing practice that authors usually submit manuscripts to journals out of their own accord. While predatory journals don't adhere to that practice. And I'm pretty sure that there are many people in this audience who would attest to the fact that now on a daily, weekly basis, you are approached by journals And I would guess the vast majority of them are predatory journals, because standard journals, I'm still waiting for my invitation from Nature to submit a paper to them. You see, the day that that comes, then we have an interesting situation, or Lancet, or whatever the case might be. But predatory journals typically solicit manuscripts by spamming researchers. And they spam by using Yahoo and Gmail accounts and other various means. So if you get an invitation to submit a paper to a journal, and especially if some of the other criteria apply that I'll go to, be alert to that. Predatory journals have very strange titles. Legitimate journals usually have field and discipline appropriate titles. But predatory journals have bizarre, if you just look at the list of predatory journals which is still available, here's just two examples. There's a journal called the Global Journal of Advanced Research. Now really, I mean, that doesn't make sense in any world. And then you have disjointed. By disjointed, we mean that they combine fields. So there's the Journal of Economics and Engineering, the Journal of Humanities and Life Sciences. So they literally, some of these titles just don't make sense in any scholarly communication. One of the real reasons why people are caught in the trap of these predators is that these journals offer very quick publication time. They guarantee that you're not going to wait more. In some cases, they say within a day, you'll have a decision, never mind an acknowledgement. I've looked at some of them say within 2 to 3 weeks. Now again, this is interesting because we know from experience, those of us who've published in various journals, that the publication lag time varies, that the best journals usually have the longest lag time because the competition is highest. And so I can understand to some extent, especially in a very competitive environment where someone says, well, if this journal guarantees for me that within 2 or 3 weeks I'll have a decision, why would I go to a journal that takes 3 months to give me a decision? Now here you have to be careful because there are now increasingly other mega journals like PLOS journals. PLOS One is one of those journals that also guarantees a very quick turnaround time. But they have something like 5,000 reviewers on their payroll. Well, not on the payroll because they don't really get paid. But most of these journals, I can tell you, is run by a single person from my house somewhere in a country which I won't name. But there are about 4 or 5 countries where we know to look for them. So the point is that, but this becomes a really seductive message. Another, one of the most robust indicators is the use of fake metrics. Let me just, because some of my colleagues from the University of Leiden, who are leaders in bibliometrics in the world, Robert and Jos are here, there are only a few legitimate organizations in the world that generate journal impact factor values. It's Thomson Reuters for Web of Science, it's Leiden for Scopus. There are 1 or 2 others. But when you get a predatory journal says, we have a journal impact factor, and some of them do the following thing. They say, we've got a journal impact factor of 27.635. Like 3 decimal points make a huge difference. From the Universal Journal Impact Factory organization, then just be a bit cautious. So there's some nice papers now about companies, about the use of fake journal metrics. And that, to my mind, is one of the surest examples that you're dealing with a predatory journal, because that's our problem. Can we distinguish between predatory journals and legitimate open access journals? Peer review, very quickly. Predatory journals very often have fake editorial boards. In the Fuller article that sits behind this, I've investigated some of this. I looked at some of these predatory journals. I've discovered the names of people who died 110 years ago. There's a famous Journal of Social Sciences, which is one of the predatory journals. It lists one of the top sociologists, Richard Brown, in the field, who died 10 years ago. He is still named. I sent an email to some other people in Germany who was listed on the Journal of Human Ecology. I said, do you know that you are listed as a member of the editorial board? The person came back and says, no, I've never been approached. So these people make up editorial boards. Even better, they will invite you at a small fee to join the editorial board. For $50, some of these, you can all now become members of these editorial boards if you just pay $50. So you see, all of this goes against the ethos and the culture of standard journals. So Beale has been silenced. He started about 10 years ago, And what he did was to start a list of standalone predatory journals. At the time when I did this study, there were 1,200 plus standalone journal titles in his list of predatory journals. But even more importantly, he also at some point started a list of predatory publishing houses. And Linda Lorenzen at Crest worked through all of these lists. You can't believe it that there are more than 900 publishers on the latest list that you have available for him that have more than 23,000 journal titles in these publishing houses. So we're not talking about small numbers. We're now talking about anything up to 23,000, 24,000 possible predatory journals making the rounds. So what have we done at Crest in the study? We have a database at Crest, which we get in conjunction with the Department of Higher Education and Training, where we get all the titles of all the scientific papers produced by South African academics for the last 10 years. So literally, it's a database which is unique. We have everyone who's published with a South African author for the last 10, 11 years. It's more than 120,000 papers. And we have their journal titles. So we went through all the journal titles, linked it to Jeffrey Beall's two lists, both the Standard Hour list and the list of publishers. We discovered 57 journal titles out of about 8,000. South African academics published in about 8,000 journals the last 10 years, and 57 of them are on one of the two lists of Beall. And that results in 4,200 papers. Now, I'll come to that in a moment, because ultimately that's about 3% of what we looked at. And someone says, well, that's not many, only 3%. I said, well, 4,200 papers by South African authors, that has earned them 400 million rand, or, because 100,000. So be careful if you say 3% is small. And in some universities, I'll show you it's much more. Now, there's one issue, and that is that which we took very seriously. Beall has been criticized by a lot of people in recent years that his process of judging, deciding that a journal is predatory or not, is not always very transparent, not very clear. Some people have accused him of witch hunting against specific publishers. So we decided that we're not just going to take Beall's classification at face value. So these 57 journal titles, which appears on one of his two lists, we subjected to another round of assessment. And in the report that we produced, we explain what we've done in great detail, which I won't do here. But because of this, we then classified those 57 journal titles into 4 categories. There's some cases where actually we think that Beall was wrong. He classified a journal as predatory, and we think he's wrong. We know some very specific cases that he admitted that he was wrong. And a very good example is that he had the International Journal of Electrochemical Science on the list of predatory journals. And the reason why he put it on there is because the Thomson Reuters Web of Science took it off their journal impact reports for 2 years, and then he took it off as well. And that decision has nothing to do with predatory publishing. That had to do with some other citation impact irregularities. So we basically ended up saying that 10 of these journals, we do not think, Crest do not think that they are predatory. So we classified them as non-predatory. Then we had, at the other end of the extreme, there were a few journals where we simply couldn't gather sufficient evidence to make a judgment either way. So we just said insufficient evidence. We sent emails to people and to editors and so on. And we ended up with the main list divided between where we say there's really strong evidence that this journal is correctly identified by Beall as predatory, and in other cases weak evidence. Now, the distinguish between strong evidence and weak evidence usually turns around the question about whether there are false claims made about impact factors and things like that. If that to us have become such a robust indicator. If there's some irregularities in the editorial board, that by itself did not persuade us that that's a predatory journal. So there's some, I would say that there's some margin of error here, but we would want to defend that. So here's our list now. You will see that We've taken the 57 journals, we've said which we think are not predatory, insufficient evidence, predatory weak evidence, predatory strong evidence, and the number in the cell is the number of papers that have been published and that in that journal over the last 10 years by South African authored academics. So the journal Actual Problems of Economics, he had that as a predatory journal. We think is wrong. Those 9 papers you shouldn't count. Then you have the African Journal of Agricultural Research, where people, what you will now see is, I won't of course go in the same detail through every page, but you will see that there's some journals which dominate this list of 4,000. There are about 10 or 12 journals where there are large numbers. The African Journal of Agricultural Research, the African Journal of Biotechnology. African Journal of Biotechnology is it's a journal that publishes a huge amount of papers. We think that there's weak evidence. We still would want to find out there's strong evidence. I'll say something about that journal. Then you have the African Journal of Microbiology. Incidentally, it is these 2, 4, 6 journals, 7 journals that has the title African Journal of, are all published by the same publishing house. It's called Academics Online. It sits in Lagos, Nigeria. I won't comment on that part. But if you go there, you get the website, you get no information about the publisher. You cannot get information about the publisher. If you do a Google map on its coordinates, it's a house in Lagos. It's not looking like a business block. So part of the reason why, and people have written about this outfit, Academics Online have 111 journals. They all start with African Journal of. And a number of these are, we think, clear. We think the African Journal of Business Management, I know that there's some people in the audience that might have an interest in it. We think that that is absolutely a predatory journal, and there's a few separate studies on that. I'll just very quickly show some of the biggest one. Corporate Ownership and Control is published by an institute in the USA which published about 4 or 5 journals which we think are highly suspect. They also published the International Business and Economics Research Journal. The International Journal of Educational Sciences, 191 papers. That is absolutely, we're sure, a predatory journal. This is the one he got very wrong, the International Journal of Electrochemical Science, and South Africans have published quite a lot in it. The other somewhat bigger journals, Journal of Applied Business Research, Journal of Economics and Behavioral Sciences, strong evidence for that. The Journal of Human Ecology, 289 papers appeared that. It is published by Cray Publishers in India, who also publish the Journal of Social Sciences, which is, there are no question in my mind, there's so much evidence that these are predatory journals. The Journal of Medicinal Plants Research, definitely a predatory journal. They had some others, the Mediterranean Journal of Social Sciences, some of you may know about that. That was an interesting case study. The Mediterranean Journal of Social Sciences, published by a center in Italy, actually this journal was indexed in the Web of Science. And then people discovered it's a predatory journal, and it was taken off the Web of Science, and it's now de-accredited, but it still appears in Scopus. So now you see part of the problem that you face with this. And the last ones, the big ones, Problems and Perspectives in Management, we think is a predatory journal. There's a paper, Scientific Research and Essays, Studies of Tribes and Tribals. So here is the bottom line. Out of these 4,246 papers, we think that 2,800 of them appears in journals that we think are in fact predatory journals, and another 1,000 weak evidence. So here's the summary. In total, if you add up the strong and the weak evidence papers, you get to 3.4%. The ones that we think are probable, we distinguish between probable predatory and possibly predatory, is that 2.5% are in probable predatory and 1,000 in possibly predatory journals. So what is disconcerting is that when you start to look this over time, that the increase in the last 5 years has been in journals which we think are definitely predatory, not the weak evidence, the strong evidence. And I can tell you that is mostly to do with some of these African journals off. That's where the big growth has been. Now, I'm pretty sure you can't see that at the back, so I'll just talk a little bit to this, and then there's a summary slide. This is the predatory publishing by university. So let me just say, we will not name, under any circumstances, any individual author. We don't do that in the report. I'll come back to that. But we did think that it's useful to universities to have this information. So what we've done here is we've taken every university and we look at CPUT, the Peninsula University of Technology. We think that they've published 107 papers in the last 10 years in predatory journals of strong evidence and another 80 weak evidence. That gives them those percentage. And what we've done here in the last column, we have listed all their papers that they've produced in the last 10 years and what percentage are their priority papers of their total share. So what we're saying is that CPUT has produced 1,300 papers that has earned subsidy for them in the last 10 years. And 13.8% of that are in predatory journals. 8% in strong and another 6% in weak. Let me immediately, if you're interested, Stellenbosch University, in total 1%. The lowest universities happens to be the strong research universities. The lowest proportion of predatory journals are sitting with Stellenbosch at 1%, Rhodes at 0.7%, UCT is also 0.3 is actually the lowest, and Pretoria 1.2%. At the other extreme, really problematic statistics. 25% of the output at the University of Fort Hare in the last 10 years in what we think are either strong or weak predatory journals. In fact, in strong, it's 15%. And that, we've just done a case study for University of Fort Hare about their publication profile. That we have now a good understanding of why that happened, which I won't go into now in the general conversation, but we can actually explain some of that. But you can imagine now, so if you look at the lowest proportion, 0.3% UCT, and the highest proportion, Fort Hare, 25%, this can have major implications at the university level. Even a university like UKZN, it's 3%, UJ 4.6%, UNISA 7.5%, Limpopo 11%, Venda 21%. What is coming clear out of this, which is something that needs to be addressed, is that the historically disadvantaged universities are producing more predatory journals. Does it speak to the lack of good research management at those universities, or what does it speak to? So now, how we explain these things is completely another topic altogether. What we've also done, so here is the summary. If we focus on the first two columns, the strong evidence category, the mean is 2.5%. So the universities, the publications from UCT, Stellenbosch, Pretoria, Wits, Rhodes, KZN, Free State, and UWC, and MMU are below the average for the group. And then Walter Sisulu, a lot of the universities of technology, Fort Hare, even UJ, Johannesburg and Zululand, are above the average. If you just look at the weak evidence, you find a very similar pattern. By field, that's the only other analysis that we report on here. We decide in the Web of Science, every journal is assigned to a subject category. We use the same system. So every one of these 57 journals, like all other journals, are assigned to a category. So let me show you. If you only focus on the strong probable journals, and you look at fairly high level of classification, you get this picture. Now that was not entirely surprising to us, because by that time we've looked at these titles of the journals. Half of these journals are in the social sciences, humanities. And by social sciences, we include anthropology, political science, and another 32% in economic and management sciences. So if you look at the social sciences, humanities, economic sciences, they make up 85%. They're very little. Natural sciences is small. Health sciences, 6%. Multidisciplinary, 7%. If you look at the journals in the weak evidence, slightly different, but not a huge difference, because the social sciences and economic sciences together is about 70%. Then agriculture come in because of the African Journal of Agricultural Science. So, finally, just in terms of discussion, a few points. One of the things to point out is that there is obviously a correlation between the proportion of predatory journals by university and by field, because one of the reasons why UCT, I think not the only reason, but UCT, Stellenbosch to some extent, very low percentages. These are universities with strong medical schools, big natural science faculties and engineering, smaller humanities, social sciences. Therefore, you would expect that in terms of field differences, you find a similar distribution. Whereas at UNISA, UKZN, Fort Hare, as example, you have larger faculties of these other disciplines. So there's some correlation between the faculties that you have and the fields in which you publish. But we have to ask ourselves the question, why is predatory publishing in South Africa so much more prevalent in the broad field of the human sciences, social science, economic sciences, humanities? I have some hypotheses, but it would be interesting to discuss that. Finally, 5 or 6 consequences. I've started by saying that the Department of Higher Education and Training administers a very unique system. There are very few, if any, other systems in the world where academics at universities are subsidized for what they publish. Now, this clearly has had very positive effects. There's no question about it. Between 2005 and 2015, the outputs from South Africa's universities have increased threefold, from about 5,000 publication units to more than 15,000. And to my mind, that is driven hugely by this monetary incentive. Not the only factor, it's also driven by the rating system of the NRF and other factors. But there's no question in my mind, because at some universities, the academic staff gets paid a very significant amount of money. At TUT, every academic gets 84,000 Rand out of the 100,000 Rand for the paper that they produce. At DUT, the Durban University of Technology, 70,000. And the average is about 30,000. Stellenbosch at about 12,000, 14,000 is hugely below the average. And then you have UCT and Rhodes that don't pay their authors anything. But people boast at other universities. When I speak to them and say, oh, I've published 4 papers last year, I earned another 200,000 Rand, which I can declare and I pay income tax on it. So it has become a matter of getting revenue. Well, given that our salaries are so great, I'm not sure why people are worried about that. But so the point is that the moment that money enters into the picture, you have to be careful, because then sometimes ethics fly out of the window. And so this is why we say that if we didn't have a funding system in the country, it would be a very different conversation. We now must have a conversation where the department has affected every one of these papers have earned more than 100,000 Rand for the universities, those 4,000 papers. Even if you just take the strongly predatory one, about 3,000, the department has paid out 300 million Rand over the last 10 years to that. That's taxpayers' money. It's public money, no? Just keep that in mind. It's not private money. So the first thing to say is that the moment that we put this into a monetary perspective, the ethical issues become very, very stark. This is not just an innocent issue anymore. But now the second thing is that I personally and a number of my colleagues are very careful. This is not a blaming game. So let me point out a few things. The predators here are the journals and the publishing houses. They prey on unsuspecting, inexperienced academics. There's a nice paper by a Chinese author who showed that these predatory publishers deliberately target young scholars. They go and look at the graduation brochures of universities when people get their PhDs. They send those PhD candidates an invitation to submit a paper out of their PhD. They usually sign away their IP, by the way, and then they invite them. So they prey on these people and say, pay us $500 and we'll do proper peer review and put your paper in a journal. So the first thing to say is that the blame, if we start playing the blaming game, is definitely on the side of the publishers and the editors of these journals. But you have to say that there is some responsibility, and I'll come back to that, to the individual academic and specifically senior academics and research management staff. The second point that I make in the slide is that every single one of these 47 titles appeared on the accredited list of the department, mostly on the IBSS list. So from a bureaucratic, legal point of view, no one did anything wrong. The people who published in these journals are recognized, are still recognized, mostly by the department. If you publish in one of those journals today and next year you claim subsidy, this department has to pay it out because it's on their current lists. They haven't taken any of these titles away. So no one has, in that sense, done anything wrong. We're not publishing in journals which are not recognized or accredited by the department. The interesting thing I can tell you is that the vast majority of these are not in the Web of Science or the local South African journals, but in the IBSS list, this International Bibliography of the Social Sciences. And the department is already considering dropping that list from their subsidy scheme anyway, for other reasons. So in a sense, they could change the decision-making very quickly by tomorrow deciding that any paper on the IBSS list which would affect the economic and management sciences and social sciences the worst, in that sense, can be taken off from that. I think that there are systemic consequences. The Department of Higher Education and Training, they know about this report. I've shared this with them. The CHE knows about this, the Council of Higher Education, and the NRF knows about this study. The NRF has already taken an action. Some of you would have seen from our research office, the NRF has published a declaration that in future, if people apply for rating and for funding and grants from the NRF, and they have predatory publishing in their CVs, that might make them, might disqualify them from the process. I think the Department of Higher Education and Training doesn't have a choice. They will have to take off some of these titles from their list of subsidy-earning journals. I'm more interested in some way of what this university and other universities should do. I think our research office is now sufficiently alert to this. But again, I must tell you what is quite interesting is I looked at many university websites. Most of the top research universities now have an alert about predatory publishing on their research office webpage, but not the historically disadvantaged universities, the ones that are affected most. So we have to look at the research management there. We have to look at how do we ensure that the academics at Fort Hare and Zululand and Venda and Limpopo are aware of this, because their research offices currently are failing to alert them to this. I mean, at UCT and Stellenbosch, the impact is very little. But that tells you something about differential research capacity. But I think what's going to happen is that the department will now require, every year when we make submissions to the department for subsidy, they're going to require that there's an extra check against predatory journals. That would be the first step from their side, which would prevent us. And I'll just end by saying that you cannot underestimate the impact at an individual level. One of my PhD students in Ghana just completed a study of doctoral students and their dissertations, and he interviewed 30 PhD candidates over the last 5 years. These 30 candidates had produced 190 papers since they got their PhDs, and 40 appeared in predatory journals. So then he interviewed them and said, send me your CV. They look at the CV of someone who got a PhD 5 years ago, had 5 papers, all 5 papers in predatory journals. He said, do you know that? He says, I don't know that. My supervisor didn't tell me. No one told me. This person is building a CV on predatory journals. It's terrible. At some point, even if there's some contestation, I'm willing to admit that not every journal that we think is predatory is necessarily predatory, but there's now sufficient evidence that a lot of them are. And the last thing that you want for an individual emerging scholar is to build a CV on predatory journal articles. To come to a promotion at some point and someone says, there's no way we can promote you. Did you realize that 4 of your papers are in predatory journals? Can you imagine the repercussions for the careers, especially of young scientists? So we have to look at issues with ethics. We have to look at how we train our supervisors and what advice our supervisors give to our students. Thank you very much.